Question, is it time to reshuffle the cabinet? Well, one person who will be weighing in on it is political analyst Dr. Mukesh Basdeo. Good morning, sir.
Good morning to all listeners and viewers.
Now, what will this shuffle accomplish?
Well, the Prime Minister did indicate that he's going to use the scorecard technique to actually measure the performance of his cabinet ministers. What is the effective of this is basically to increase or enhance the governance structure of the cabinet itself. And probably for the Prime Minister to determine whether or not some of the ministers are in their coming to the 2 years, whether they have performed in that particular portfolio, and you think that others may have a better opportunity to actually perform in those particular ministries.
Having a better opportunity to perform is one thing, but the external factors still remain.
The external factors still remain in that the country is experiencing severe financial difficulties, and this coupled with what you call the demands coming from society for government services, goods and services will always be there, and it's how the government decides to actually put forward its policies. Now, this proposed cabinet reshuffle will come in the heels of a budget which will be presented in September of this year, and therefore the reshuffle will allow ministers who will take on new portfolios to actually how to deliver on what is budgeted for the respective ministries.
Well, in the same way that sometimes there's a piece of downtime for someone with a short contract when they're trying to organize their next revenue stream, do you see the possibilities of that happening with ministers who would be changed or shuffled?
Well, the Prime Minister did indicate in an earlier statement that regarding his ministers, some of them were basically new in the capacity of government ministers. Some would have served in the private sector, but 2 years has been enough time, I think, for some of them to get a hold on what is to become what's to be minister, how to manage the affairs of a ministry. And when you look at the statement at the family day, the PNM family day, he did indicate it was basically linked to something else. And that other matter would have been performance in constituencies, because the Prime Minister did indicate that he will be going through the constituencies to actually get a better understanding from the ground as to how those MPs who are elected, what has been their performance. Because in a Westminster tradition, you're first elected as a member of Parliament. You're not elected as a minister. That comes as a result of the Prime Minister's discretion to appoint persons to cabinet.
We've been hearing about this call for reshuffling from different sources. Sometimes even more important than the call itself is the areas that the calls are coming from. What are your thoughts on some of the people or the reason that some of these people have been calling for such a reshuffle?
Now, the call to reshuffle is set in the backdrop of a number of what we call public issues. In the last few months, there have been a number of issues that have engaged the attention of the Prime Minister and also the public at large. And it comes from ministers' decisions and their actions and so forth. And there always are on social media issues that will engage the attention of the Prime Minister and also cabinet ministers. So I think it is a good time in the context that you're going into your second year in office. You need to actually put things in place, and the Prime Minister has recognized that he has to measure the performance of his ministers primarily, but he's also keeping it in the back of his mind that you have to actually engage in what you call the performance criteria. And the government to survive in office would have to be based on performance.
Some of these ministers who are new, as described by the Prime Minister and others, the fact that they're moved and they have other portfolios, does that make them more effective, or does that just shift the problem?
Well, some would say that you have the same deck of cards, how are you going to play with it? But some of the ministers, based on their 2-year experience, they may perform much better in a different portfolio than the one they currently hold. And the Prime Minister is the best to decide which portfolio these ministers may be best suited for, because we are looking really at 2 years. Some came into office, they made minor transgressions, they made errors and so forth, and it has occupied the attention a lot. For the first 2 years, the Prime Minister had to actually out a lot of fires in this context of ministers and their inexperience of understanding some of the procedures as to what governs what you call a government ministry. And having 2 years, I think he has been now in a position to actually assess the performance of his cabinet ministers.
It's interesting that you talk about the Prime Minister outing fires when some people say that he doesn't have the best bedside manner, for want of a better term. How much of this, or the fact that he says he will look into reshuffling the cabinet, can that be a PR PR job?
I think it's not really, it all falls in the context of what we call PR. It can be considered as a PR, but the Prime Minister has indicated that he is seriously looking at a reshuffle. Now, a reshuffle in the context is not just moving around. How the Prime look at it is not just moving 2 or 3 ministers. If you're thinking in a cabinet reshuffle, we are thinking holistically that you need to review each of the portfolios, each of the ministers, and to determine whether some of them are the best suited to fit in certain capacities.
Looking at it from performance, also looking at it from the issue of politics, who are some of the people you think may be up for a shuffle or for a shift?
Well, the government is going to its 2 years, so it's going to 3, 4 years, and so forth. So I think the Prime Minister may be looking at specific ministries that he would consider that is suited for the needs of Trinidad and Tobago. They have issues in the area of, let's say, transport. The sea bridge and the air bridge issue that occupies the attention for the last month. There were issues in regarding the Ministry of Sport, and that has occupied the attention. In the last couple of weeks, we had issues regarding the Ministry of Education. All of these has been in the public domain. So if anyone is to look at it and based on what has been reported in the media and in social media, I mean, these are some of the ministries that one can think about. Ministry of Finance is also in the highlight, how we deal with the economy and economic issues. So these are concerns I think the Prime Minister may have to look carefully based on what was happening over the last 2 years.
The fact that there's been a shift, there's recently been a shift in transport, what kind of message does it send if there is another one so suddenly?
Well, if there is a shift in the Ministry of, let's say, Works and Transportation, I mean, that has been recently happened. The minister I would say the minister might not have been given an opportune time to actually deal with the issues. But in some instances, when you're thrust into these positions, it's sometimes you have to make decisions immediately based on what you call public demands. The public really doesn't really care about if you're new. All the public is really concerned about you have to deliver on certain services, and they expect performance from day one. And sometimes ministers may not have that time to settle down to truly understand the ministries, the staff, and even the responsibilities that they are placed in.
These expectations from the public, they're given more access and more visibility now due to social media. How does that play into the thoughts going into this reshuffle?
Well, what we are seeing is that, I would say in the last 5 to 6 years, social media has played a tremendous part in informing the public. Some people depend on social media for information. It has become what we call a major challenge we call mainstream media, print media, electronic media. And you tend to gauge what is happening and how the people are thinking, because social media provides a platform where anyone can just post their views and opinion, but it is a reflective of what is going on within the wider scope of society. And we have to respect that maybe 10% of maybe what is on social media may be factual, the other 90% may be based on other sides of innuendos or false information. But at the end of the day, it is a reflection of what society actually thinks.
But even though it is a reflection, it may not be a holistic one.
It may not.
And depending on where people get their information from, and they filter out one side, so what can be assimilated is very subjective. How do you deal with that? Where do you draw the line between, yes, I take what you're saying, but at the same time, this is the broader context because we're not operating in a vacuum?
I think the Prime Minister's decision to go to the constituencies is an indication that he prefers to go to the ground rather than depend on what is on social media. By going to the constituencies, by going to the constituents themselves, he will be able to gather information from the ground. It was basically similar when he decided to take the trip to Tobago on the ferry. He got a first-hand experience of what the population was actually experiencing, what the sea bridge was about, how the citizens of Tobago are actually been affected by this service. And hopefully that experience and going down to the ground will allow him to now to have a better understanding, rather than dependent primarily on ministers or what takes place within the ministries. By going down to the grassroots level, it allows the Prime Minister to get a first-hand view of what the people is actually saying, what they are thinking of his administration and of how his governments are performing.
Can we tie this back to the approach used by the PNM in local government elections? So there wasn't really that much of a media blitz, but there was a lot of on the ground talking to the people. And how do you think this kind of affects the overall perception?
Well, the use of what we call cottage meetings, these town hall meetings, is what was utilized by the Prime Minister. One would recall that the Prime Minister did have put on the front burner they call conversation with the people. However, after one such meeting, everything basically shut down. Maybe it was how it was basically structured, but at the end of the day, going to the ground really allows an individual to have that information. And one would recall that the strategy was also used not only in the local election, but also in the general election, that the use of what you call mainstream media to actually carry the information was somewhat not utilized. So the campaign strategy of the PNM in the general elections, also the local election, contained within it more going down to the ground and meeting with the people, rather than having mass meetings and televised and on radio and television and so forth. And it was a different strategy. Whether the strategy can work now, it is a way of actually connecting to the people. And an administration that is not connected and not listening will ultimately pay the political price when it comes to the next time when the population will have to cast their ballots.
But at the same time, some people now they think of consultation as a dirty word because it seems as though the term is used and things happen, but at the same time, the voice or the vox populi doesn't necessarily translate into the final manifestation. Do you think people are kind of jaded about such meetings?
I think people are, because they tend to see it as more of a talk shop. If it is that I attend this consultation and I give my views and opinion, and I say, let me measure the effectiveness of it as a citizen, I go to 3 or 4 of those consultations, and I take copious notes and so forth. At the end of the day, when I see the policy paper, the document, it is not no way reflective of what the citizens had actually aired. Sometimes consultation is just part of the policy process. You have to consult, and therefore you go out and you have these public meetings and so forth. But it is set between a bigger picture called the whole concept of good governance, that consultation or participation allows for proper policy making. And proper policy making, starting from the ground level, will basically ensure that policies are rational, are correct, and meet the needs of the population. But if we tend to use consultation just because of the name itself, and you go out and you talk to the population and it's just, that's it, you already made up your mind on your policy itself, it doesn't really result in any way called proper process. And the people tend to see it as just come in and talk, and they'll put less value on the consultation process.
So we continue this conversation after the break. Stay with us. This is Good Morning Trinidad and Tobago. Welcome back. Good morning, Trinidad and Tobago. We're still speaking with political analyst Dr. Mukesh Basdeo, spreading our wings a little bit from the cabinet reshuffle, but at the same time talking about governance. And someone raised the point, we like to talk about governance, not government. And I think that is what we're going to try to deal with. But speaking to the people on the ground is one thing. Getting their thoughts, their ideas, some things that they like, dislike, is one thing. But in terms of having conversations with the opposition, what is the role of the opposition with regard to making policy?
The opposition role in the formulation and implementation and assessment of policy is important. In the Westminster tradition, we tend to see the opposition as basically a group of MPs that sits in a parliament and basically opposes everything. And it is a position that basically emerged out of our colonial days, where the executive basically dominated the legislature, and those who are elected by the people really didn't have the power to actually affect policy or to change legislation, and therefore they took up the mantle of just opposing everything in the colonial policy. And it is a tradition that we have come to understand what opposition is about as opposing. But the role of, let's say, in a modern parliamentary system or democracy as ours, the role of the opposition is important. The opposition provides what we call an opportunity to actually bring forth ideas that comes from them and then from their constituents, ideas about a policy. And in our parliamentary structure and how our parliament operates under what we call special majorities, the opposition is integral in the passage of legislation that requires what we call special majority. The framers of our independence and republican constitution had placed within it these special majorities and had given the opposition a certain degree of power to ensure that proper policy, proper legislation are basically implemented that will meet the needs of a population. It did not give government what they call the power just to pass legislation by simple majority. We got to understand we are not operating under the standing orders of what they call the House of Commons in the United Kingdom, where a simple majority allows the executive dominance. And in this context, the parliament in Trinidad and Tobago should not be seen as just a rubber stamping the policies of the government. So the opposition plays an important part in ensuring proper governance in Trinidad and Tobago.
So how can individuals hold both the ruling administration and the opposition to account? Because sometimes it seems as though politicians are just politicking for politics' sake.
And that tends to be the question, that how are they held accountable? I think the citizens can only hold these parliamentarians accountable whenever there is an election. So the performance of the opposition will be tested when there's the next parliamentary election. But at the same time, members of parliament can be tested by their constituents. Rare do you find in a parliament that you hear the MPs talk about, well, my constituents have this view, my constituents that have that view. It is more in the context that when they're elected, it is the party's view and not the view of what you call the constituents. And if they're ready to get down at the what you call the grassroots level, it'll be interesting that some of the views that are espoused by these these MPs who they are party's position may not be the view of what you call the constituents themselves. So I don't know the extent of which they canvass their constituents to gather that information and to basically bring it into the public domain, because there are national issues that will engage the attention of members of parliament, but there are issues that can be localized to specific constituencies and geographical areas of this country that you have to actually air it and bring it forth.
It's amazing to me sometimes that two political parties will walk through the same area and emerge from it with such differing stories. But talk to me about the role of the individuals, apart from just holding politicians accountable, holding themselves accountable. Because it seems sometimes that after we vote, we give politicians all the power and we don't keep any of the responsibility ourselves.
Well, in political theory, it is often said that once you elect a politician, that's the end. Jeremy Bentham had a very simple perspective on politicians, that once you elect them, you must basically have a total distrust for them, because there's always a likelihood that they will not do what they said they were going to do. And in a modern democracy, that tends to be the case. You may tend to have basically 2 minutes of power. Once you put the X on the ballot paper and you put it in the box, your political power ceases to be, as it is now transferred to these members of parliament. But during the process of a term in a parliament, there have to be mechanisms that will always keep the people basically involved and knowledgeable of what the politicians are actually doing. So the role of social media in a modern democracy today, the role of pressure groups and community-based organizations, these institutions are important to foster democracy and to strengthen democracy. At the same time, it provides information that are different from what the politicians, it gives us what we call a third view of what is happening within society, because the politicians may at times basically provide us with information that they want us to know. They may not always provide the information that is really required. And it is when you have information emerging out of what they call different organizations that may have a more keen interest on the issue itself, you get a perspective that is different.
It's very interesting to see what are some of the potential ramifications of the cybercrimes legislation in its present form, what it will have on this third view with regard to whistleblowers, the role of media, and what can be criminalized. But moving back to the cabinet reshuffle though, if ministers are reshuffled, they have different portfolios, responsibilities. Where can we look at this scorecard and say, okay, well, this is what you're supposed to be doing, and this is where you're rating on the scorecard right now?
Well, I think the Prime Minister is the best person to actually provide that information. He's going to design his scorecard. He's going to use whatever measurement to assess the ministers. What may be better required is that if in his making his decision, he can actually explain to the public, well, these are the criteria I utilized, that I used to measure the performance of my members, of my ministers, and this is the decision I've actually come up with. I believe that some may have been in this ministry, I think they may be better suited for X ministry. And you have to take it in the context that the Prime Minister is thinking in the next 3 years, because in the next 3 years he'll be facing general elections and maybe local government elections. So you have to think of it in this context, that he is positioning his political party towards what you call general elections in 3 years' time. And by going to the constituencies, by making the demand that his members of parliament, those who are elected, must spend more time in the constituencies, is really trying to indicate the connection between the parliament and also the people. One would recall in 2007, former Prime Minister Manning did utilize a similar measure to measure the effectiveness, and it was used to determine whether or not certain MPs will face the re-election in 2007. So it has happened in the past, and I think it is going to be used again by this current Prime Minister.
You spoke about the current Prime Minister having, or most likely having a window, a mental window of 3 years to position the party for the next general election. What will it take for parties in Trinidad and Tobago to think beyond the next general election?
Well, I think what some parties must think about, well, they may have timeline, and there are certain events that they're going to use to actually measure the effectiveness. Some will look at towards general elections, some will look at local elections. These are what you call the benchmarks that will determine the performance or the ability of what you call political leaders to actually determine their effectiveness. And we often look at these benchmarks as a means of determining how these politicians actually perform. If we look at the last administration, the then Prime Minister basically suffered a number of losses in a number of elections, by-elections, local elections, and so forth. And it was used in this context to measure the effectiveness and what is possible to happen, let's say, beyond 2020. And persons will basically wait on to see what is going to happen. But I think political parties must be able to have what they call, to look beyond these benchmarks, like in 5 years' time and 10 years' time, what is really their policies and what will be their programs. They have to formulate what they call policies that now you have a much more mature, much more knowledgeable population. They have much more information that is available to the public today than, let's say, 10 years ago. So it's easy now for the public to actually measure performance based on what they are seeing and what they are actually getting from governments and oppositions.
And hopefully we can move forward as a people past some of these benchmarks and into a manner that actually looks at country first, but I guess that remains to be seen.
Well, that's yet to be seen. I think the goal is always political office.
Well, thank you very much, political analyst Dr. Mukesh Basdeo. Thank you very much for being here and giving us some of the insight. And we